Hi guys, so for my cloud-based lesson, I decided to focus on Google Expeditions. Google Expeditions is basically a VR experience for students where they're able to take virtual field trips. So I decided that my technology platform would be Chromebooks. My students in my whole district have one-to-one Chromebooks, and they're pretty familiar with that, so that's what the medium I figured I would focus on. And then the reason I chose Google Expeditions is I actually went to the Suffolk Asset Conference a few months ago, and one of the sessions that me and my the technology specialist in my district went to was on Google Expeditions, and my school ended up purchasing one class set of the VR goggles, which you can see right here. There are all different types that work with Google Expeditions, but these are the ones in particular that my district had purchased. I do have to say that they are very expensive, so I'm very fortunate to work in a district that can afford, these different types of technologies, but it is definitely a very expensive purchase. So I specifically chose Google Expeditions because, again, I saw it at the conference and was very interested in it. But the reality is, field trips are amazing, and I wish I could take my students all over the world. And with the help of Google Expeditions, I basically am with this virtual experience. So the unit that I was starting at the time was Ancient Egypt, and I always try to, before unit starts, really pique my students' interest and get them excited about the topic that we're going to be learning about. In this case, it was social studies. So I found on Google Expeditions that they had an expedition to ancient Egypt, and the expedition basically focused on 5 different sites, and those 5 different sites were all ancient ruins in Egypt, so different pyramids, that the students could explore. And again, that was a great way for me to get them excited about the unit and really get a good visual picture in their head of the geography of what these things look like that we were going to be studying. So I'm going to actually show you guys a short little video just to give you guys an idea of what the Google Expeditions look like. Unfortunately, I didn't bring home my Chromebook, otherwise I would have recorded this on there. It's at school, but this little video gives you an idea of what it looks like. So obviously this is going to look much different when you're actually viewing these different sites in a VR goggle, because it's going to give you that 3D experience. But just from that short video, you can tell that there are hundreds of different options of different places that you can take students, and really they can be used in all different subjects. My teacher that I work with, I teach English and social studies, and she teaches my students math and science. She's used it to introduce astronomy to the students. She's used it when she's talking about different creatures underwater. So you really can use it in many different forms. I think I'm going to talk about it later on, but one thing that I'm definitely interested in trying now is bringing it into the English classroom when we're reading books, that take place in different time periods, to give those students that same visual picture in their head of what the time period looked like. There are different options on Google Expeditions where you can show, the same type of idea to the students, and again, give them that visual picture of what the time period looked like. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you guys through my actual lesson and how it went. I have my students for about 41-minute blocks. I have them for 2 periods, one for English and one for social studies. So this lesson was intended for one of those periods. I do have to say, because it was the first time we used the VR goggles, that it did take a bit longer. It ran into the other period, whereas I think that if I, going forward, doing it again and not having to spend so much prep time on using the Google Expedition, that it will definitely go quicker. So the first thing that my students did, which they're pretty used to doing, is coming right in and grabbing their Chromebook. And when they went on their Chromebook, they actually filled out a Google form. And the Google form was just 5 basic questions that I wanted to see what they already knew about ancient Egypt. I knew that they were familiar with terms like pyramids and ruins, but it was just a way for me to assess and to get their brains thinking about these different types of terms. And then after they filled out their Google form, they closed up their Chromebook, and I basically started to explain the virtual field trip that we were going to be taking today, which obviously piqued their interest, and they were all very excited and perked up when they heard that. So I explained that I was going to be taking them to the ruins of ancient Egyptian pyramids. And the one thing that I definitely recommend for anyone doing Google Expedition at first is to go over the rules of using the goggles. At first, I kind of thought this was silly when my tech specialist mentioned it. I'm like, oh, they're going to be fine, but it really, really came in handy, and I'm super glad that I spent the time doing it. One thing I will say is if the students are looking for a very long time in the Google Expedition goggles, the viewfinders as they call them, that they can actually get a bit like motion sickness, because you have to imagine they're looking at something 3D very up close, and they're moving their heads back and forth as they do it. So it was important for me to go over how to hold them and what not to do with them, and making sure that explaining that we were going to take breaks throughout as well, for just that purpose of giving their eyes a break. So after I explained the rules to them and how to properly hold them, then I allowed them to actually explore on their own. Actually, let me back up a second. One of the big things that we had to do was actually get the goggles ready to go. So the tech specialist and I already had them what's called queued up and ready to the actual ancient Egyptian expedition, so that way we didn't have to spend so much time having the kids do that part. So that was a little bit of prep work on our end, but it certainly saved some time. So once the students actually looked through the viewfinders, I gave them time. Originally I had intended only for like 2 minutes. It probably ended up being something more like 5 minutes, because they were so excited when they first started to look at them, and I knew that if I started to try and teach and talk, once they had first put the goggles on, that they would not be listening to me. So that at that 5-minute time was good for them to kind of look around. Some of them wanted to like stand up and start moving around, which I did not suggest, because obviously they can't really see anything else around them. They're just looking in their viewfinder. So they were sitting as they did that, and they were just looking side to side. And then after I had them explore on their own, then what I did was I directed their attention to the first pyramid. So the way that works is, actually I'm going to skip forward to the next slide to show you. So this basically, as the teacher, is what I'm looking at. And if you see down here, the students, I was doing this on my Chromebook, so I didn't have that 3D experience, but I was looking on my Chromebook to be their guide, as they call it. So what I do is I see what the students are seeing, and if you look here at this little circle, what I can do is tap any point in this Google Expedition, and what it will do is it will, on the students' goggles, it will show you an arrow, and that arrow will direct the students to one specific spot. So if I'm trying to talk to them about this particular Egyptian, artifact, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to point to this point, and those little smiley faces show me all the little faces of where my students are looking at that time, to make sure that they are focused on what it is that I'm going to be talking about. And if you look here on the right, it's kind of hard to see. There are actually different scaffolded questions for you. So it's a basic summary of what it is that the students are looking at. And then it goes into the different types of questions. There's beginner questions, intermediate questions, and advanced questions. And then it also gives you some more context for the area that you're looking at. So this really helped me as the guide, being able to speak about, what it is that they're looking at. One thing I will say is that you definitely, as the guide, need to do some research and some background. The students had questions that, to be honest, I didn't even know the answer to sometimes, which was a learning experience for both of us. And I did take time later on to go through any of those questions, and together we would find the answer to them. The reality is you're probably not going to know the answer to everything. You're probably not going to be an expert on that topic, but you definitely need to spend time going through the expedition on your own to make sure that you really understand what it is that you're going to be talking about, because the students are simply looking in their goggles, but you're just up there speaking for most of the time that they're doing that. So I did that with the first pyramid and then explained, the history of what they saw. And then I followed that same exact procedure for the other four sites that it took them through. And again, we would pause in between, give their eyes a break, and I would also answer any questions that they had. After we finished going through the expedition, the students returned their goggles. We have them in a pretty nice case. So the students returned their goggles to their case, and then they went back onto their Google Classroom where they had an exit ticket. And the main point of the exit ticket wasn't even so much specifically on the information they learned, but I really wanted their feedback on the Google Expedition process and whether they liked it, what they didn't like about it, things like that, which would further help me in using that technology in the classroom. And overall, when I looked at the feedback, they all loved it. They're like, please, let's do more of it. So it was definitely very good feedback. So what I learned from the process is they absolutely loved doing the Google Expedition, as I mentioned. And as I said before, you definitely have to be prepared with a lot of information and be prepared for those questions that sometimes you don't know the answer to. As I mentioned before, you definitely need that wait time in the beginning to allow them to explore on their own because they're going to be distracted and excited. And another thing is definitely, it depends, I guess, on the age group of your kids, but there was one student that I had to take the goggles away from, that he was just fooling around and not using them properly. And as I mentioned before, they are very expensive. And I just didn't want him to break it or to hurt anyone else around him because he wasn't paying attention. I found that overall that really increased their interest in the topic that we were talking about, and it also gave them that great visual that we would refer back to throughout the whole unit as they had that picture in their mind. As far as future possibilities, I mentioned it before, I definitely want to bring this into my ELA classroom. One of the books that we read throughout the year is called The Watsons Go to Birmingham, and it focuses on the civil rights movement. So just looking through Google Expedition, they have different sites that I could take them to that, again, would give them good background information and a good visual that would set the stage for learning for my students. And another thing that I'm definitely tossing around the idea of allowing the students, very responsible students, to take turns actually being a guide. I found that it was a really great experience doing that research and preparing for it. And I think that if I had students that were really interested in a topic and they did their research, I could see them eventually being a guide and having that experience would be pretty awesome for them. So that was my experience with Google Expeditions. I'm very excited to use it more in my classroom. I know my students loved it. I loved it. It is definitely a decent amount of prep work on the teacher end to get everything ready, and I would definitely suggest, if you try it, to have a tech specialist there. I know for me it was hard for me to be in the front of the classroom and judge the actual talking and teaching part while trying to help students that were having any sort of technical issues or needed more redirection. So having that other adult in the classroom is very beneficial. But overall, I loved this project. I love the experience. And I know that not only my students but also I learned a lot from it. Thanks, guys.